Sunday started like any other, right up until a woman I barely knew demanded $250,000 from me while I was quietly cutting my steak. We were in my dining room, a space I've kept pristine and quiet ever since I was widowed. My son Julian had been dating Sloane for about 6 months. She sat there with rigid posture, a calculated smile, and eyes that scanned every mahogany end table and framed painting in my living room like she was taking inventory. Next to her was her mother Lorraine, who couldn't stop gushing over the silverware. Julian, meanwhile, hadn't touched a bite. His hands were shaking slightly under the table. I noticed how pale he looked, the dark circles under his eyes giving away sleepless nights. I'd chalked it up to the stress of running his architecture firm, but a mother's intuition rarely misses the mark. Something else was wrong. Sloane set her fork down, pulled a leather folder from her designer purse, and slid it across my linen tablecloth. Eleanor, Julian, and I have been planning our dream wedding. She began, her tone strangely formal. We really want the family involved. The final budget comes out to $350,000. We figured that since you're so financially secure, you'd be thrilled to cover it. I didn't blink. I didn't stop chewing. I just stared at her. Asking for that kind of money, with the casualness of asking for a glass of water, was a level of audacity I rarely encountered. Lorraine nodded enthusiastically from across the table. I was about to reply when I felt a rough brush against my knee. Julian's hand. With a quick, stealthy movement, he slipped me a small, crumpled piece of paper. I took it without looking down, feeling the frantic indentations of a pen with my thumb. I kept my eyes locked on Sloane's smile as I unfolded the note in my lap. I glanced down for a split second, just long enough to read my son's message. Mom, she's a scammer. Help. I slowly folded the paper. I took a sip of water, dabbed my lips with my cloth napkin, and fixed my eyes dead on Sloane. I smiled with absolute calm and said just 5 words that shattered her confident facade in an instant. Bring me the itemized receipts. The silence that followed was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Sloane opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Lorraine dropped her fork onto her china plate with a sharp clink. Something dark had just woken up at that table. Sloane's bewilderment lasted only a few seconds before her features hardened. Her smile vanished, replaced by a tight, pale line. "Receipts?" she repeated, letting out a short, humorless laugh. "Eleanor, we're talking about family trust here. High-end luxury wedding planners don't work with immediate paperwork. They work on good faith deposits." Lorraine jumped in, quickly leaning over the table and invading my personal space. "Eleanor, please. This is the most important day of your son's life. Families in our tax bracket don't go around demanding receipts like it's a grocery run. It's about status." I cut another piece of steak. The temperature was perfect. In my house, a $350,000 ask requires signed contracts, tax ID numbers for every vendor, and a precise breakdown. I replied, chewing slowly. "You have 72 hours, Sloane. Bring me the official contracts from this supposed planner and the itemized quotes on company letterhead. If everything is above board, there won't be an issue." Julian kept his eyes glued to his plate. Sloane glared at him clearly, waiting for him to jump to her defense. He just swallowed hard and gave a timid shrug. "Julian, are you really going to let your mother insult me like this?" Sloane demanded, her voice rising. Julian opened his mouth, but before he could stammer out an apology that would only dig his grave deeper, I stood up and cleared my plate. "Dinner is over. Lorraine, Sloane, you know the way out. Julian, come with me to the kitchen. I need help with dessert." Sloane snatched up her leather folder so violently she nearly tore the tablecloth. She stood up abruptly, her mother right behind her. Neither said goodbye. A moment later, the heavy thud of the front door slammed shut. In the kitchen, Julian collapsed into a wooden chair. He buried his face in his hands and let out a long, shaky sigh, like he'd been holding his breath for months. "Mom," he whispered, unable to look me in the eye. I don't know how to get out of this. I walked over to the sink and turned on the faucet. Start from the beginning, I ordered, leaning against the counter. And don't leave out a single detail, no matter how small it seems. Julian looked up. His eyes were bloodshot. What he told me next made it crystal clear that the wedding was just the tip of the iceberg. We sat in the living room, lit only by a single floor lamp. Julian had a glass of water in his hands, turning it endlessly. At first, everything was perfect. He explained, his voice hollow. But then the emergencies started. First, it was Lorraine's car, the transmission blew. I paid the $9,500 repair bill because Sloane was sobbing, saying her mom wouldn't be able to get to work. I nodded slowly. The classic sudden emergency. Then it was an investment, he went on. A high-end furniture import business Sloane was going to launch. She asked me for $35,000. She gave me account numbers, showed me glossy brochures, but the storefront never opened. When I asked about it, she told me the city permits were delayed and said if I didn't trust her, our relationship had no future. And you stopped asking? My tone wasn't reproachful, just analytical. She isolated me, Mom. Every time I tried to see my friends, she'd get sick or manufacture some crisis. I always ended up caving. Right now, my personal checking is practically drained, and she's been pressuring me to dip into the joint business fund. The joint fund. 3 years ago, when Julian decided to open his own architecture firm, I opened a shared bank account. I seeded it with a significant amount of capital to act as a safety net in case his business ran into cash flow issues. I was the primary account holder, but he had a debit card and full access. Has she tried to get into that account? I asked, feeling a prickle of warning in my fingertips. Yesterday, she asked for the login info. Julian confessed, looking down. She said the wedding planner needed to verify our liquidity before locking in the date. I wouldn't give it to her, and she lost it. That's why she orchestrated lunch today. She wanted to back you into a corner directly. I stood up from the armchair. The picture was perfectly clear now. We weren't dealing with a demanding bridezilla. We were dealing with a parasite who had bled my son dry and was now coming for the main vein. Go get some sleep in your old room, I told him. Don't answer Sloane's texts tonight. Turn off your phone. What are you going to do, Mom? What you should have done months ago, I replied, walking over to my desk. Protect the house. I opened the safe and pulled out the bank files. First thing tomorrow morning, the rules of engagement were going to change drastically, and Sloane was about to find out that not all widows are easy prey. By 8:30 a.m. on Monday, I was already sitting across the desk from my bank manager. The man had known me for 2 decades. There was no need for sob stories or venting about my soon-to-be ex-daughter-in-law. Business is business. I want to withdraw 95% of the funds from the joint account I share with my son and wire them directly to my exclusive personal account. I instructed, sliding my idea across the desk. Of course, Mrs. Sterling. Do you wish to keep Julian as an authorized user on the main account? Absolutely not. Revoke any secondary cards in his name. If there are any pending charges from this weekend, cancel them if possible. In less than 15 minutes, the money keeping Julian's firm afloat, which Sloane viewed as her personal slush fund, was safely under my absolute control. My son would have to learn to keep his business running without my safety net, but at least that money wouldn't end up in Lorraine and Sloane's pockets. I got back home around noon. I'd barely dropped my keys into my purse when I heard the crunch of tires on my gravel driveway. It was Sloane's car. She stepped out, marching with purpose, carrying the same leather folder from yesterday. She didn't ring the bell. To my shock, she pulled out a key and unlocked my front door. I waited for her in the foyer, standing tall with my arms crossed. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me. "Did I scare you, Eleanor?" she asked, pasting on a fake smile. "Julian gave me a spare key weeks ago. I just stopped by to drop off those quotes you wanted. I know older folks get a little anxious about money. I didn't flinch. I stared at the key in her hand, a direct invasion of my sanctuary. Put the paperwork on the glass coffee table, I instructed, unfazed by her pathetic attempt to insult me. She strutted into the living room, leaving her designer tote bag wide open on the sofa. She started pulling out papers. "You'll see everything is perfectly in order," she said, turning her back to me for just a split second to arrange the sheets. It was just 1 second, a fleeting moment of distraction. I moved silently toward the table, passing her open bag, and with a swift, precise motion, I snagged the keychain holding my house key. I unclipped it with one expert tug and slipped the cold metal into my blazer pocket. Sloane turned back around, grinning, entirely oblivious to the fact that her all-access pass to my home had just been revoked. "Here you go," Sloane said, gesturing to 3 color-printed pages she'd fanned out on the glass table. "The florist, the reception venue, and the luxury catering. As you can see, the numbers match up perfectly. We need the $100,000 deposit by Friday." I looked over the papers without touching them. They featured fancy logos and pretentious names like Elite Events and Imperial Floral Designs, complete with routing numbers but no physical addresses or tax ID numbers. These are missing the legal contracts, Sloane. This is a brochure, not accounting documentation." She huffed, her patience visibly wearing thin. "Look, Eleanor, Julian already approved all of this. I actually tried to put the catering deposit on Julian's backup card this morning, but for some reason, the bank declined it. It's definitely a system error. That's why I need you to wire the money today. I am not losing my date because you're being stubborn." I smiled internally. The card freeze had taken effect faster than I'd hoped. She was already trying to raid the joint account behind my back. "There is no system error," I replied, my voice freezing cold. "I canceled that card this morning." Sloane froze. Her eyes widened in shock, and a flush of angry red started creeping up her neck. "You did what you have no right. That is Julian's money. That is my money. It was sitting in an account under my name for my son's business, and now it is protected." She snatched her tote bag up, furiously throwing it over her shoulder. "Julian is going to hear about this. I'm going to make him demand his share of his inheritance early." "You are ruining our wedding," she screamed, storming toward the front door. "Julian is asleep in his old room. His phone is off. You can scream all you want from the driveway, but you will not raise your voice in my house," I said, opening the door to show her out. She stomped out onto the porch, turning back to glare at me with pure venom in her eyes. "I'll be back tomorrow, and you'd better have that money ready, you cheap old hag, or you will never see your son again." I shut the door in her face. Through the wood, I could hear her rummaging frantically through her bag, muttering curses. I knew exactly what she was looking for and exactly what she wasn't going to find: my house key. I smiled as I heard her car engine gun aggressively. Now it was time to look into the paperwork she'd left on the table. I sat at the dining table with Sloane's 3 printed quotes and a mug of black coffee. I closely examined the first one, Elite Events. According to this sheet, they were charging $40,000 just for day of coordination. I pulled out my phone. I didn't dial the number on the letterhead. Instead, I opened the state's business registry on my tablet and searched the company name. No website, no LLC on file. Nothing. I picked up my phone and punched in the number printed on Sloane's quote. It rang 3 times before a woman's voice, bizarrely familiar, answered in a rushed, clipped tone. "Elite Events," the voice said, forcing a professional customer service pitch. It was Lorraine, Sloane's mother. I hung up immediately. The sheer audacity was almost impressive. They had mocked up fake invoices and set up burner phone numbers manned by their own family. I grabbed my car keys. If the phone number was a total sham, I needed to verify the physical address buried in the fine print at the bottom of the Imperial Floral Designs. Quote, I drove 20 minutes out to a rundown commercial strip on the edge of town. I parked right in front of the address. There was no high-end boutique brimming with imported hydrangeas. It was a tiny, dusty storefront with peeling paint and a faded "For Rent" sign in the window. I got out of my car and peered through the glass. The inside was completely gutted, save for a few empty cardboard boxes shoved into a corner. I pulled out my phone and snapped 3 clear photos of the empty unit, making sure the street numbers were visible in the frame. As I was walking back to the car, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Julian. Mom Sloan just texted me from her mom's phone. She says you kicked her out and stole her keys. She's completely unhinged. She's threatening to dump me if I don't get her the money today. I'm coming over. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Julian was still operating out of panic, but the intelligence I just gathered was going to be the ultimate cure for his blindness. I had the photos, the bank cancellation receipts, and absolute proof of their con. All that was left was the final blow, and it was going to happen on my turf. I fired off a quick text to my son, Tell Sloan and Lorraine. I'm treating them to dinner tomorrow at 8 to sort out the deposit issue. You need to be here too. I moved quickly the next morning. By 8:00 a.m., a locksmith had already rekeyed every single door in the house. I wasn't leaving any loose ends. By noon, a physically drained Julian walked through the door. Sloan is furious, he said, dropping onto the couch like a bag of rocks. She says, if we don't pay the deposit today, the wedding is off, and we're done. I looked at him sternly, but kept my voice level. At 32 years old, you have let this woman manipulate you out of nearly $45,000 with nothing but lies. They are coming to dinner tonight. You are going to sit down, and you are going to listen. Under no circumstances are you to apologize. Are we clear? He nodded slowly. At 8 o'clock, sharp, the doorbell rang. Sloan and Lorraine walked in dressed to the nines, flashing triumphant, smug smiles. They clearly assumed my invitation meant I had caved, and the checkbook was wide open. They strutted straight into this dining room but stopped dead in their tracks. There were no plates, no wine glasses, no food. Just a thick manila envelope resting exactly where my plate usually sat. Sit down. I ordered, resting my hands on the back of my chair. It wasn't an invitation. It was a directive. Lorraine let out a nervous little laugh at the sight of the bare mahogany table. No dinner, Eleanor. I assumed we were celebrating our new arrangement. Dinner is served to people who tell the truth at my table, I replied, taking the head seat. And you two have been feeding on lies for months. Open the envelope. Your deposit is inside. Sloan tore open the flap with an impatient huff. Her arrogant smirk completely dissolved the second she pulled out the papers. There were no checks. The first thing she saw was the bank printout proving the total liquidation and closure of Julian's joint account. Her gold mine was officially boarded up. Next, she slid out the glossy, full-color photos of the abandoned storefront for her so-called Imperial Floral Designs, right alongside the state business registry search, proving her event planner didn't exist. What is this? Lorraine stammered, the color draining from her face. The end of your grift, I said, folding my hands neatly on the table. Julian already told me how you isolated him and conned him out of $45,000. You really thought you could come for my nest egg with fake invoices and burner phones. You messed with the wrong widow. Sloan slammed the papers down her face, flushed crimson with rage. She shot a look at Julian, desperately waiting for him to jump to her defense like he always did. But my son didn't even blink. He stared at her with absolute disgust. The hard evidence laid out on the table had finally broken the spell. "It's not your money, Sloane," Julian said. His voice was rock steady, devoid of the fear that had consumed him for months. "We're done. There is no wedding, and there are no more loans." Sloane slammed her palms onto the table, her face twisted with fury. The sweet, loving girlfriend act was dead and gone. "You are a coward," she shrieked at him. "You are absolutely nothing without me. Your pathetic little firm is going to tank." Lorraine tried to interject with some manufactured dignity, sputtering nonsense about a massive misunderstanding and how I owed them an apology. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my dress, entirely impervious to their tantrum. "I am not debating the mechanics of your scam. The facts are on the table," I said calmly. And right now, you are in my house. A house you no longer have a key to because I had the locks changed this morning." Sloane's jaw actually dropped. The realization hit her like a freight train. Her access to my life and my assets had been severed at the root. "You have exactly 60 seconds to walk out the front door." I continued gesturing toward the hallway. "If you don't, I will call the neighborhood security patrol. They are rarely polite to trespassers." Sloane grabbed her designer bag and tried to yank Julian by the arm, but he took a step back, standing firmly by my side. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just held Sloane's gaze until it finally clicked in her head that she had lost. Lorraine grabbed her daughter's arm, and the two of them hurried out. I shut the door behind them and slid the new deadbolt into place. The heavy metallic clack was the final period at the end of their game. Silence settled back over the dining room, but this time it felt cleansing. Julian gathered up the forged invoices and tossed them into the trash bin without a word. "I was such an idiot, Mom," he whispered, slumping onto the sofa. "I almost let them rob you blind." I walked into the kitchen, poured 2 mugs of tea, and handed him one. "Naivety has a price tag, Julian. Yours happened to be $45,000. Consider it an incredibly expensive tuition fee on learning who to trust." He nodded slowly, staring down at his mug. "What happens with my business account?" "It stays frozen, and it stays in my name," I answered firmly. "I helped you get your firm off the ground, but it's time you kept it running with your own hustle. I am not going to inject capital to cover for your personal blind spots. My financial peace of mind is not subject to your romantic mistakes." He didn't argue. Julian took a deep breath clearly, just relieved to be free of Sloane's psychological grip, and accepted the consequences of his actions. We never heard from Lorraine or her daughter again in the weeks that followed. Without access to our bank accounts or my house, they simply vanished into thin air. Julian moved into a smaller apartment and sold his car to free up some cash flow for his firm. One Sunday afternoon, while I was out back watering the patio plants, the doorbell rang. It was Julian. He was holding a pastry box from my favorite bakery and wearing a relaxed, easy smile I hadn't seen on his face in a long time. "Got any coffee, Mom?" he asked. "There's always coffee for people who don't bring fake invoices," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. I closed the door behind him. My nest egg was secure, my peace was intact, and my boundaries were clearer than they'd ever been.